Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see people still joining. Welcome to the second annual UCLA Luskin Center Climate Adaptation Research Symposium. If this is the first session you're joining, or if not, you're still welcome. And thanks for coming to this session on what I think is really one of the foremost challenges of our time. Proactive planning for resilient and equitable communities in an era of climate crisis. Before I turn to our three incredible speakers, I want to acknowledge UCLA's presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. The effects of continuing settler colonialism, which has long facilitated fossil fuel extraction, are evident this week in Hurricane Ida's disproportionate and ongoing toll on tribal communities on Louisiana's Gulf Coast in places like Houma, Pointe-à-Chêne, and Île-de-Jean-Charles. I want to note this is a disaster that's still very much continuing to unfold. I'd really encourage those watching today to support community-led efforts for a just recovery however you can, including through organizations like the Lowlander Center or Another Gulf is Possible, or other direct donation and mutual aid networks. So it's one thing to acknowledge injustice, and it's another to do something about it. So I'm thrilled to be here moderating a session featuring speakers whose work is dedicated to understanding more effective ways to do exactly that, to act to advance equity, justice, and sustainability, and to dismantle and transform the policies, structures, and systems that impede equitable processes and outcomes. So before introducing our first speaker, let me acknowledge and thank our collaborators who made this day possible, and also give a huge thanks to my colleague, Lolly Lim, researcher at the Luskin Center, and our production coordinator today, who is currently making my ability to present this possible. So thank you, Lolly, and thanks for helping to conceptualize this event. For everyone who's in the audience right now, thank you again for being here. If you have questions for the presenters, you can ask them using the Q&A window. We should have hopefully a pretty good amount of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So please keep the questions coming, and I'll moderate a discussion once the speakers conclude. So we have three speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Sara Meerow. Dr. Meerow is an assistant professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. I'll turn it over to Sara now and introduce the next speakers in turn before they present. So Sara, take it away.
All right, can everyone hear and see me, hopefully? Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for this opportunity to share some of my latest work with you all. So today I'll be presenting really the sort of culmination of a project that I've been collaborating on for the last few years, where we're really trying to bring together kind of different sources of information and make sense of this question of whether collaboration improves resilience planning. So this project is looking at the relationship between governance networks, plan networks, and resilience to flooding in 4 coastal cities. And I'll explain what I mean by all of those in a second. But I just want to acknowledge that this is very much a collaborative effort. This was an NSF-funded project with some colleagues at Texas A&M, Sierra Woodruff and Bryce Hannibal. They have since moved on from Texas A&M, but also students there, Malini Roy, Melina Matos, and then a student at ASU as well, PhD student Phil Gilbertson. And all of us have really been working as a team. And what I'm presenting now is the effort to try to bring together the different strands of this project. So first, a little background. I mean, I think if you've been paying any attention to the news in the last, week or two in Louisiana and the Northeast, then I probably don't have to tell you that flooding is the costliest natural hazard in the US, and that it's expected to get worse and is getting worse as a result of climate change. And of course, cities that are on the coast are particularly vulnerable to coastal storms, as well as sea level rise moving forward. And in the face of these these and other climate risks, many cities and urban scholars have been calling for more focus in planning and policy on enhancing resilience to these hazards. But it's not entirely clear what a resilience approach to planning would actually mean. There's many different ways of interpreting this concept. But in general, when we're talking about resilience planning, it's about recognizing that our urban systems and residents are complex, right? And that they're vulnerable, yes, to different shocks and stresses, but that all these different threats are interconnected, and we're trying to bring together in resilience planning the different actors and sectors that are connected and address these challenges systematically. So probably the biggest driver behind the urban resilience agenda, specifically in recent years, was the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient City program. And that program explicitly aimed actually to transform urban governance in this way, to try to encourage this collaboration, to break down the silos that often occur in cities between different sectors, different departments, say within government. And they also supported this by having cities hire a chief resilience officer whose job it was explicitly to try and coordinate these efforts, and also to develop a sort of a resilience strategy plan, right, that would try and connect these different shocks and stressors and come up with policies for them. Now, there's been a lot of academic literature that suggests that more collaboration is needed to enhance resilience, and that it actually really matters who collaborates and how these networks of collaboration are actually structured, right? So studies of collaborative governance, and there's a whole literature on that, have really consistently reported benefits to enhance to more collaboration, such as more social capital, learning. But actually, there really are not that many studies that actually evaluate the plan or policy outcomes of this collaboration. And similarly, there is a growing body of work within planning that argues that we need to look at how different plans in cities are actually that guide development, how they're working together or not as a network, right? So, we've tended to look at plans in isolation, right? To look at a comprehensive plan or general plan or hazard plans, but to not think about how all those different plans are working together, and whether they're actually working in concert or at cross purposes, and how these different policies and different plans actually shape resilience to hazards. So the idea here is that the plans and policies should actually be interconnected and consistent, but what some of this work that's coming out is showing is that often they're not, right? And so in this, this project, what we're trying to understand is what the relationship is between governance networks, plan networks, and then resilience, right? And so the urban resilience literature, and in many cases, the policy discourse seems to really assume that collaboration is going to lead to better planning and that this in turn will enhance resilience. But as we dig into that, we see that there actually isn't a lot of empirical work that actually examines how these governance networks are related to these networks of plans and then the resilience outcomes. So that's really what we're trying to do here. And that is this project goal, which, as I said, we're really wrapping up. And this, to try and get at these relationships, we focused in on flood resilience planning in 4 cities, Baltimore, Boston, Fort Lauderdale, and Seattle, all, of course, coastal cities in the US. And what I want to do now is explain how we're trying to actually get at these 3 components, right? How we're trying to understand the governance networks, the network of plans, and their impact on resilience. So starting with governance networks. So in order to actually try and assess collaboration in these networks, what we've done is we've surveyed different organizations involved in flood resilience planning in each of the cities, and ask them who they collaborate with, how often, how important those collaborations are, and then analyze those relationships using social network analysis. So what you can see in this graphic here, these are the weekly collaboration networks around flood resilience in those 4 cities. And just, looking at them, we can see that they have, pretty different looking structures, right? We can see, different numbers of organizations that are involved, different structures of how they're actually collaborating with each other on a weekly basis. On here in this table, which I'm not expecting you to read, but you can just see kind of what comes out of this network analysis, or also you can see who the key organizations are, right, in each network. So which are the organizations that are most connected to other ones in these weekly collaboration things, and you can calculate different sort of network metrics or organization level metrics to understand their role in the overall governance network. In the same survey where we asked about those collaborations, we also asked organizations directly whether they think that collaboration has actually increased as a result of resilience initiatives in the city. And you can see that across the 4 cities, the responses are quite different, right? So we can see, for example, that, Boston and Fort Lauderdale or Baltimore thought they were not as sure about the collaboration had increased as much as, say, Boston. A lot of the respondents thought that it had increased. So that's the first part. Now moving into this second part, this idea of these planned networks. So how are we assessing this? So we're doing this actually in a number of different ways. We're analyzing the content of the planned networks in each of the cities. So here we've assessed the quality of the different plans in terms of their goals, what we're called the flooding fact base, or essentially the information that these different plans within each city's plan network contain about flood risks, the public participation elements in those plans, and then also what sort of guidance they have about how they're going to be actually implemented and monitored. And again, you can see, just looking at this one example from this, that the quality of plans along these different principles really varies across a single city's network. So that's what this graph is showing, those different plans and how the quality varies. We also look at how much the plans actually directly reference each other. So again, thinking about it as a network, right, we would assume that plans are going to be more consistent and have less of these working at cross purposes if they actually are aware and recognize connections between other systems. And so we actually, again, we counted and then used network analysis to actually look at the references between different plans in each of the city's network. And then we also, again, here asked those organizations involved in planning directly whether they actually think their plans are aligned. And here, again, you see some variation across the cities. And so now, moving into the third piece, right, which I think is really kind of, in some ways, the hardest to assess, which is, are these plans actually enhancing resilience, right? And so how we have tried to get at this piece of the puzzle is by actually assessing the policies in the plans and scoring them based on whether they would likely increase or decrease vulnerability or resilience to flooding in different parts of the city that are at risk, both to current flooding as well as future sea level rise, and then trying to map those out. And we adopted an approach that was developed by Phil Burke and colleagues, the Plan Integration for Resilience scorecard. And so, again, that's what it essentially does. And it's a rough thing, but it's scoring all of these individual policies in the plans that have a spatial component and can be mapped onto these flood risk areas based on whether they would improve resilience or actually harm it. And then you can sort of add up these scores for different areas, so you can look at the spatial distribution of policies as well as the sort of cumulative effect of them, again, in a sort of rough way. So in this graph here, you can see these are the number of policies that we identified in each of Boston's plans that would either positively or negatively impact flooding, again, within those flood risk areas. And here I should just note that we're really focused on physical vulnerability and recognizing, of course, that there are lots and lots of really important other aspects of enhancing resilience, social resilience, things that are just not as easy to sort of spatially map in the same way. So this is a limited assessment, but it's definitely, I think, a really important piece of flood resilience that we're assessing here with these policies, or at least the potential impact on them. And then again, as I said, we can actually map that out spatially. So here you can see in Boston, where we see higher focus, we see more positive policies, negative policies, and the sort of net scores for each of these flood vulnerable districts or areas. And again, here we also try to triangulate this by actually asking city departments and organizations in the survey whether they think their plans are going to affect, how they think they're going to affect vulnerability to flooding. And again, we see some variation across the cities. So here are all the pieces that we've been, all the data we've been collecting, the analyses. Now we try to put it together. So we start out by looking at an individual plan level, right? And so here, really, we hypothesize based on the literature that higher quality plans will have higher scorecards, or will do better in this scorecard assessment, with the idea that if you have a better plan, you should have more policies that are going to, have a positive impact, right, on resilience to flooding, that they're going to be, more consistent, et cetera, and you're not going to have as many of these inconsistencies there, and therefore that they would have the potential to enhance flood resilience. We also hypothesize that better integrated plans, or those that are more connected, right? So thinking about those references, that they would also have higher PERS scores. So let's see what we find. Well, sorry, one second, trying to change these slides. So we do find evidence to support this first hypothesis. So we see a significant positive correlation between the individual plan quality and PERS scores, including the fact-based. So we had this idea that, maybe flood information in lots of different plans, being aware of where flood risk areas are, that's going to be really critical. And so we do see this relationship. We also do see this between, overall scores as well. And we also see a positive correlation between the plan quality and references to other plans. So this does sort of support this idea that it can be beneficial to really mainstream or include flood information across different plans, right? So not just having them say in a hazard mitigation plan. But we see that the relationship between a plan's connections to other plans and this scorecard is a little bit more unclear. So we don't find any negative correlations, but we don't see significant positive correlations either. So, these PERS metrics of percent positive, the net scores, and average by district are all not significantly related to these plan references. And in fact, the plans that actually cite more plans and plans that are more often cited in other plans seem to have a significantly more negative policies, or those that would increase vulnerability. And so this could be a function of time, right? So that older plans are potentially cited more. It could also be the types of plans. So, for example, we tend to see more negative policies, right? In what we call negative incomprehensive or infrastructure plans, essentially because they're calling for new development or infrastructure in flood zones, and that gets scored as negative in our assessment if they're not including and specifically mentioning how they're going to be protecting those from flooding. Okay, one second. Having trouble getting my next slide to go. Here we go. Sorry. So now what about bringing it all together, right? So what about this city level? This was individual plan level, looking across the cities. At a city level, we would expect that cities that have more collaborative governance networks will also have better quality, more aligned plans and better resilience policies. So do we find that? Well, it's complicated, right? As is often the case with these sorts of things. Here, this table, we tried to pull together a number of different metrics from each of those three pieces that we're trying to pull together. And we've standardized those metrics so that all the indicators basically are within the same range. So the lowest of the 4 cities is 0, the highest is 1, and the other ones are represented as fractions. And then the boxes or cells are essentially color-coded to show that. So higher green means they were doing better compared to the other cities. This is just in comparison to each other. And, when we look across, just looking at these colors, we can see that, the results are pretty mixed. So, for example, we see that survey perceptions of plan alignment are, fairly consistent with our analysis of their alignment. The same with survey perceptions of policy impact, we don't see as much of that consistency between the perceptions in the survey of the impact on vulnerability with the scorecard. Now, this, of course, could be because in that question asking about the impact, we're not so focused just on what the physical vulnerability is. So it could be that they perceive the plans having other resilience impacts that are not captured in the scorecard method. And when we look at the actual governance networks and the network of plans, we just don't really see that clear of a relationship, right? So for Fort Lauderdale, we see that there's sort of lower, they seem to do sort of low, come out lower in terms of their network connectivity, although according to the surveys that's improving, but they did quite well in terms of their network of plans and the policy assessment, right? Boston, we see sort of a mixed metrics there in terms of their governance network. They did have quite a strong plan network in terms of quality, but they had some more negative policies in the scorecard. Baltimore, a little bit weaker, it would seem, across the board. They tend to be doing lower in comparison. And, in Seattle, we can see that they didn't do as well in the plan assessments, but quite well in terms of the network. So, yeah, we're really still trying to kind of make sense of this. We also have a lot more indicators for each of these 3 pieces that we could look at. I just wanted to show sort of a sample, but I think the key takeaway here is that it seems like this relationship is pretty nuanced. And we find evidence that across the 4 cities, these higher quality, more integrated networks of plans do seem to be better enhancing resilience to flooding, as we've assessed it through the PERS. But the relationship between collaboration and planning may be a little bit more complex, and I think clearly more research is needed. So I'll end there. I'd just like to thank again my collaborators on this project, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, because this is again really something that we're still trying to make sense of. So thank you. And Liz, would you? Okay, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fascinating and couldn't have been more perfectly timed too, so I appreciate that as well. I already have questions, but let's turn first to our next speaker, Dr. Linda Shai, an assistant professor at Cornell University's Department of City and Regional Planning. Linda, it is all over to you.
Hi, everyone. So lovely to be here with all of you. Thank you for coming. I know there are immense demands on your time. Before I give my presentation, I wanted to acknowledge that Cornell University is located on the traditional homeland of the Gayagono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayagono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayagono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayagono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So my presentation dovetails actually very nicely with Sara's, although we use quite different methods to do our research. The title of this is State and Local Buyout Programs with Barriers and Lessons for More Equitable Floodplain Management. This work is a collaboration between scholars at Cornell University that come from public policy, landscape architecture, planning, and public health, as well as the Nature Conservancy, with the aim of translating some of this research into practice. And so for those of you who are here and paying attention in the United States to the issues of floodplain management and flood risk mitigation, you know that there is a long history of FEMA policies that try to, most of the policy has been focused on the National Flood Insurance Program, and a very small portion of it has been dedicated to buying people out or relocating them after a disaster if they have sufficient enough damages and there's cost-benefit analyses that work out. The government will then buy out the property owner at fair market value in order to remove them from risk. And so partly we want to reduce the kind of risk that people have and reduce the costs that governments have to pay for, but we also want to enhance our environments. We don't want to leave behind a whole landscape of waste and vacancy and decline. We want to have, on the one hand, this kind of ecologically restored habitat, and on the other hand, even more vibrant communities of people who have come together, moved into more dense communities that contribute to community well-being and thriving. So that's what we want, but so often what we actually have is something like this, where after a buyout, the communities that remain continue to be traumatized by the fact that they continue to be located in places that are exposed to natural hazards, and that they are now increasingly surrounded by places that are vacant and that are maintained at best as mowed lots, or more often as kinds of vacant sites that are paved over. These areas are highly compacted in order to support development, so translating them into more ecological sites is not easy and often requires additional funding that is simply not there. And as well, obviously, there are a lot of equity concerns, chief among them, a consideration that the FEMA floodplain buyouts program is too small. So in the past 40 years, there have been 40,000 buyouts in the United States. And in the future estimates of people being at risk, it's at least something like millions upon millions of households who are living within either a riverine or a coastal flood zone. And even so, it is unsustainable. There's not enough funding to sustain this. And people are beginning to ask, maybe you should take a buyout sooner than later, because who knows how long this program will be around. It is extremely bureaucratic. On average, these buyouts can take 5 to 6 years for the funding to reach the homeowner, which means that many homeowners who are struggling with trying to make decisions within the first weeks of a major flood before mold invades everything as to whether they should demolish or repair or rebuild or move, they simply cannot avail of the program. And also the program is highly inequitable, that it is reaching more densely settled urban places that have the staff and capacity to apply for these funds, that it is discriminatory and it targets more low-income peoples, because the cost-benefit analysis ratio means that more low-income households are going to offer more bang for a certain amount of money from the city. So they tend to buy out low-income households, yet offer other kinds of funding, such as home elevation or support for seawalls and other kinds of infrastructure, to wealthier communities that are seen as too wealthy to lose, especially for local tax dollars. At the same time, the programs tend to discriminate, so that renters definitely are not able to avail of these programs as much. A lot of more indigenous households that are in tribal lands have land tenure systems that are not necessarily legible the same way that a single family household is. And so there are these kinds of barriers to entry. And then there's also limits in scale, because the program is targeting individual properties rather than a community. And so it remains extremely difficult to buy out an entire block or to move a whole community and to sustain the existing social capital ties that are especially important to low-income communities. And finally, there are very limited ecological gains. So a study of buyouts that were done between 1990 and 2000 found that of those, 40% were remained a vacant lot of some kind that was either grass or paved. 40% were some kind of recreation site, which could be a baseball field or a trail or a park. And only actually about 6% were restored to any kind of ecological condition. So the aim of our research is to say we want to reform FEMA. There's a lot of work ongoing by many different scholars, some of whom are presenting here, to improve the FEMA program. FEMA themselves under the Biden administration has come out and asked public solicitation of comment for how can we improve this whole entire program and what should it look like. And so in our research, we focused on learning from 5 different programs that are among the best at the subnational level. They operate at the state level. New Jersey and Washington. New Jersey has a Blue Acres program, Washington's Floodplains by Design. 2 county level programs. One is Charlotte-Mecklenburg County Stormwater Services Division, and then Harris County Flood Control District, and one at the local level, a program that's run out of the city of Austin. So each of these programs are ongoing. They are constantly in place. They're standing programs. Oftentimes what happens is there is a disaster, and so funding from the federal government comes to the state, comes to localities, and at that moment, either the state or the county or the local governments will create a program designated to help channel these funds and to reach out to households. But then these programs will end up closing once the funds dry up. And that means that there's no opportunity to sustain the learning and the institutional practices. So each of these programs are ongoing. They have been existing for some of them for many decades. And over time, they have also developed alternative sources of funding. And these sources of funding come from property taxes, stormwater taxes. Sometimes there are bonds that are passed, like in Houston, or the state designates additional funding through the legislative budgeting process. And so these additional funds not only help the local governments pay for the cost share that is required by FEMA, a 25% local cost share for any federal dollars that come in, but it also allows them to use these funds to do something that the federal funding does not allow them to do. Federal funding often has various constraints or requirements, who you can give it to, how much you can give them, and these local funds are able to allow programs to do whatever they like based on local needs and priorities. So we want to see, not necessarily to say like everybody can do what they do, but to say what have they done that we can learn from, so that we might think about integrating that into the broader federal program so that everyone can benefit from their learning. So our research agenda has 3 different questions: one to look at the equity impacts, one to look at the ecological benefits, and one to look at the relationship between the social and the ecological policies and outcomes. In today's presentation, I'm just going to focus on how have these subnational programs addressed the issues of social equity limitations that are found in the National Buyout Program. So these are our methods, quite different from Sarah's presentation. We focus more on literature reviews, analysis of these different programs and policies, focus group discussions, as well as interviews. So judging from the literature, we can identify broad categories of inequities of existing buyout programs. So some of these would be pre-disaster planning. There are these historic injustices. For instance, development and zoning guidelines that would have cited low-income communities or public housing into areas that are known to be at risk. If you were to overlay, for instance, red line communities and flood risk, that kind of cause of existing inequality. There's also infrastructure investments that have been denied to some of these communities for many decades, even as they were invested in other middle class or white or wealthier communities. So these are a set of historic injustices. In the contemporary moment, there are beneficiary selection issues. So the cost-benefit analysis I've already discussed based on property value, it pre-selects for people who own their property value and a certain kind of benefit that you have to, a target that you have to meet. And not all of these options are available to low-income groups or those who do not own property. And this also certainly favors traditional family structures, especially the single-family home. It doesn't even necessarily reach business owners or landlords or multifamily structures where there are condos or rentals. At the same time, then there's the buyout process as a kind of procedural injustice. There's a lot of lack of transparency. The bureaucracy itself makes it very opaque as to which program are you participating in, what are the terms, what are the benefits. It's a very reactionary program, so you cannot anticipate a disaster and try to work towards getting people out of out of risky areas ahead of time. And there's evidence to suggest that low to medium income households actually have to wait longer to receive even less aid. And then afterwards, there's a whole set of concerns around post-buyout, these holistic well-being measures. Where do people actually relocate to? Is the housing that they move to any safer than where they are? Are the communities they move to of more or less social vulnerability? Are these homes more or less affordable? And there's very little information on this because programs mostly don't even track where households go. But the limited research that has been done seems to indicate that households often end up, because affordability has worsened over time, they end up buying lower income households. I guess the most recent one of the studies on Houston showed that wealthier homeowners are able to buy a home more proximate to their former location, and more of them are closely located, so that you are able to retain your sense of community with others of your income class closer to where you formerly were. Whereas those who are poor have to buy homes that are farther away, and they are far more dispersed. So not only are you losing ties to the previous location where you were, the schools, the jobs, but also you are losing ties to your community of other residents. And there are these perceptions that communities sometimes actually gentrify post-buyout, although this may vary. In Houston, there's evidence to suggest that while vacancy in wealthier communities might be a sign of gentrification or well-being because there's more green amenities, in poorer communities that actually results in perceptions of decay or decline or vacancy that actually reduces property values. There's very limited attention to whole community preservation of social ties, and there's certainly very little about place commemoration or dealing with the trauma and the loss of these types of places. So when we look at these different 5 programs, what we see is that they do really quite a lot with these middle two, the distributive and the procedural justice dimensions. So for instance, some of these programs use alternatives that try to diversify the cost-benefit criteria in order to make them eligible to those who are, for instance, illegal immigrants, or who are renters or landlords or other kinds of groups. In Austin, they have a whole program that engages with landlords so that they are able to participate. Then in New Jersey, they actually hire experts to help families so that they have caseworkers who work with them. And another program in Harris County, which is actually not FEMA, but run by the Housing and Urban Development Department, allows households that are undocumented to participate. All of these programs, because they have operated for many years, have excellent websites. They provide very clear information to walk people through it. Some of them hire staff in New Jersey, for instance, that work at the local government that often have a lot of caseloads to help them provide the staff expertise. In Austin, they have real estate experts who work on housing communities afterwards. They have increased the cap on how much funding they can give so that households in Austin are able to find another house that they can afford in sort of their price bracket. And the difference between their current house and where they're going to move to, that difference is paid for by the Austin program. In Harris County, after this is Houston, after Hurricane Harvey, they have passed a policy that prioritizes the worst first, meaning that the communities that were hit the hardest, that have the lowest that have the highest social vulnerability scores, are going to be prioritized first. And so a lot of these things are actually immediately relevant to the federal program and can be considered. How do you broaden the criteria? How do you widen that so that more groups are able to be eligible? How do you make these different programs more transparent and communicated to groups? There's narrative storytelling, there's peer-to-peer networks that can support and help households participate in this program. And of course, the more that households participate in the program, the more that you have, or rather, the less you have checkerboarding of the buyout sites, which means if you have a whole contiguous area, you are more likely to be able to do new projects that are of value to that community, such as restoration or greenways or other amenities. So what enabled these programs to do this work? One, as I noted, is that they have these independent sources of funding. And a lot of the things that they explicitly talked about as being their approaches to make these programs more humane and more sensitive relied on their uses of non-federal funding. So sometimes these places that they have identified to be their local risk do not meet the federal standards for the frequency or intensity of flooding. And so they're able to use local funds in anticipation of a next disaster to continuously work to reduce the number of households that are living in at-risk areas. At the same time, they talk about their standing operations, their ongoing leadership, and the retention of their staff who are able to provide these programs. And so they continue to learn over time. Austin, for instance, is one of the only programs that monitors and tracks where people move to. And they require that where they move to cannot be a house that is in an at-risk area, in a flood-prone area. And so they're able to track where people do go and how they are over time. In Washington State, the Floodplains by Design program, it's able to pool the various sources of funding and create a one-stop shop so that local governments that apply into that fund or tribal governments are able to get a single source of funding that allow them to do multi-benefit projects at the local level. But some of the barriers that they speak of are a lot of these programs tend to be based at engineering type organizations, the flood control districts or the stormwater utilities or the ecological departments. And so these kinds of staff tend to be technically trained and prepared, and they were never taught how to deal with distraught homeowners, engaging with individual households in these very traumatic times, or dealing with communities that are fearful or angry or otherwise I guess in grief of having to move and be dislocated is oftentimes for another time, and it opens up all sorts of historic traumas as well. And so they lack a kind of social capacity to deal with the very tricky issues, especially as we now go from kind of a general sense of community well-being, offering more humane, more sensitive programs to specifically being anti-racist or reparative programs that have to open up these much trickier and more political questions of difference. So for instance, there's this wonderful quote that the director of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg program said, "We being engineers, we went straight to the solution. We said, what number can we plug in here? And how about that change score?" Their program, they tried to design a new equity score that said the more likely a community was going to gentrify, the more we should try to avoid buying out in that community because they might not have somewhere they can move to and be able to afford to go. And then as we talked more about it, came up that it may work for this one purpose, but we're not so sure it could be universally applied. So we said, okay, stop. We can make the math work. We can make numbers do anything. But is the change score what we should be using, or is it something else? And isn't it better to have the conversation about should there be something else with people who know more about racial inequity and inclusion? We don't have that expertise. After some really honest conversations with our African-American staff, we decided we needed outside resources because we were looking at statistical stuff like where we've been working in the past, where we needed to work in the future, driving towards residual risk. And they basically said, you white people don't know what you're doing. You are in way over your head. But what all these programs do not really talk about are being able to deal with these issues of pre-disaster or historic injustices, sometimes that have been caused by their own agencies and choices of investment. Those issues never came up in their responses to our questions. And sometimes these choices were outside of their agency control. And certainly all of the issues that were related to post-buyout holistic well-being that deal with affordable housing or community well-being or place attachment, those were far outside both their staff capacity, but also their jurisdictional purview. And so these are, I think we have so much research that's focused on how to make FEMA more responsive and more equitable and more just and better. But oftentimes the agencies that are dealing with these issues, they only control a quite narrow slice of what causes inequity in a floodplain vulnerability situation. And so if we want to deal with that broader question, we have to engage, as Sara noted previously, with a broad set of organizations at multiple levels of government as well as multiple agencies across the city. So here's some more quotes from the city of Austin, where the program person says, a lot of people are looking to us to learn, and that's left us scrambling to see who we should talk to. I think we need to branch out beyond floodplain managers. Our culture of buyouts, it's tied into affordable housing, racial equity that goes beyond flood risk. And another real estate expert says, we're not helping the situation. Yes, we're making people safer and taking out dangerous housing stock, But in doing so, we're driving prices up. It's a net decrease in the housing stock. So there's a lot of institutional silos. And in some of these cities, the plans are coordinated so that new development may not be sited in floodplains. But in a lot of these cities, and they have been working for many years, they continue to put development in floodplains. Most of these cities' housing policies, or in the state and county levels, they do not account for resettlement housing demand based on what's happening at the local level, much less for managed retreat or migration from outside of the geography. And there's no consideration for that. I think it's really interesting, even when we try to form these focus group discussions, it was very difficult to find housing people who felt that they had anything to contribute to this conversation or anything to say, because they simply said, this is not what I do, this is not relevant to me, even somebody that we reached out to at HUD. And so these kinds of barriers exist at all levels of government and have to be something that we address. So in summary here, the lessons that we have for federal reform, there are some specific things, especially about distributive and procedural equity, that can be inputted into the federal program. There's a lot of need for having these be actually institutionalized. And so we're not just talking about changing the policies, but creating the organizational capacity at state, county, and sometimes local levels in order to enable more broadly a lot of these communities that otherwise do not have the capacity to develop these programs to avail of this programmatic expertise. There's improving the bioequity program itself may be like making chairs on the Titanic floatable. We have to think about this at a much more holistic level in order to get integrated planning at all levels. All right, that's it for my slides. Turning it back to you, Liz.
Linda, thank you so much. As someone who works on buyouts, this is exactly the kind of research I've been waiting for, and it's incredibly interesting and important. So continuing our buyout theme, we'll turn now to our last, but definitely not least speaker, Osamu Kumasaka. Osamu is an urban planner and co-founder of BuyIn Community Planning, working with community leaders to develop better buyout programs. I first got to know Osamu years ago through the Climate Migration Network, and I'm really excited to learn from this latest work. So thank you.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Great. Okay. Hello, my name is Osamu. Thank you for the intro, Liz. Today I'm speaking to you from Somerville, Massachusetts, on the ancestral unceded territories of the Wampanoag tribe and Massachusetts peoples, and as a student at a land-grant university that has, since its earliest days, profited from the sale of territories stolen from 82 other tribes in the Western United States by the Morrill Act. Like Liz said, I am co-founder of BuyIn Community Planning, which is a small planning firm focused on pre-disaster planning, and primarily by helping under-resourced municipalities design programs that help people relocate out of flood-prone homes. Kelly, Leilani, Main, and I started this firm because we're interested in building the field of climate adaptation and becoming part of the community of practitioners who are trying to promote better ways of doing things. BuyIn uses community data and mapping tools to help homeowners, communities, and funders solve the challenge of chronic flooding through proactive planning that embraces voluntary property buyouts. And our vision is a future where anyone can freely and easily relocate from disaster-prone properties while bringing the best parts of home with them. Today, I'm going to be presenting some research that I'm in the midst of conducting with support from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, or ASAP, and NYSERDA's New York State Climate Migration Modeling Accelerator. This research is about buyout programs, which are a tool that local governments have used to influence climate migration. I used very similar methods to Linda, and so I'll try not to be too duplicative, but I've attempted to understand if there are ways to change programmatic policies and practices in order in order to make these programs available to people who want them and to prioritize health and housing outcomes of participants, or what Linda was calling holistic well-being. This is research for my master's thesis, which will inform a report to policymakers at New York State agencies, including those which may end up managing future statewide buyout programs, as well as those bodies that might be planning to integrate buyouts into climate adaptation planning and programs more broadly in New York State and New York City, such as the New York State Climate Action Council and the Climate Smart Communities Program. I want to start out by describing how increasing flood risk in the US impacts residents' health and how it may constrain residential mobility, as we seem to be seeing in some areas. And the question that I've set out to try to understand is how buyout programs can enhance equitable access to mobility in New York. Before we talk about buyout programs, I'd like to highlight some key trends which seem to be contributing to the growing risk along the dimensions of physical flood hazards, social vulnerability, and individual scale and community scale adaptive capacity. Flood exposure is underestimated and increasing across the country. At least 14.6 million properties are located in the 100-year flood zone, according to First Street Foundation, a nonprofit that has been analyzing flooding risks across the country. And severe and chronic flooding events are becoming more intense and frequent. Sea level rise is increasing the reach of coastal flooding events, particularly in the northeastern United States. And Americans really are not moving away from areas of high environmental hazard, but by and large are moving towards such areas, while state and local governments are struggling to mitigate flooding, or even limit its construction in flood zones, and particularly under resource municipalities, which might depend on revenue from property taxes and development fees, particularly as revenues have declined amidst the coronavirus pandemic. Flood risk to residential properties is highly concentrated in certain states, certain cities, and certain neighborhoods, and this distribution is not random. Investments in sewers, levees, and other infrastructure rescued some neighborhoods from flooding, but disinvestment and segregation left historically redline neighborhoods behind. One thing that cities with disparities in flood risk in redline neighborhoods, like New York City, have in common is that they're still highly segregated today. And in 9 of the 10 cities with a larger share of formerly redlined homes at risk for flooding, the share of non-white households in those redline neighborhoods is also greater. So we can see the list of those cities here. It's not just wealthy homeowners who are at risk of flooding. A recent analysis found that the number of affordable units exposed to flooding in the US is projected to more than triple by 2050. And the greatest concentrations of those exposed affordable housing units are in New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, so and cities in the Northeast. The number of affordable housing units exposed to coastal flooding in New York each year by 2050 is over 5,000 by their estimate. And Atlantic City is one of select number of cities where more than 50% of the affordable housing stock is at risk of flooding in 2050. So now that we've surveyed the problem, I'd like to just give a quick overview of how some economists think that the crises of climate change, exacerbated flood risk, and unaffordable housing intersect with and exacerbate one another in order to characterize a population of people who are stranded in the flood zone, quote unquote. I believe describing this condition, which may precede or even foreshadow flood-driven displacement, if left unaddressed, can help policymakers create better tools for addressing flood risks. So there is a rapidly advancing institutional trend towards more actuarial reflection of risk in flood insurance, housing markets, and lending practices. We're seeing a new cottage industry of companies that assess climate risk to real estate, 427, Climate Check, and First Street Foundation that I cited earlier. They're partnering with real estate listing websites like Realtor.com and Redfin. The National Flood Insurance Program is being updated to be more reflective of flood risk, and they claim more equitable. And states are passing flood disclosure laws for buyers. And some folks think that mortgage lenders may be next in kind of better incorporating flood risks. The concern that national media outlets have cited is that as hurricanes and coastal flooding becomes more frequent and severe, that we will reach a tipping point at which millions of homes will become valueless stranded assets. And what I'd really like to focus on is, so we are seeing some signs that this could be the case in both national and regional studies of flooding risk on housing prices, where we're seeing divergence between the growth of prices in high-risk areas and low-risk areas. But I think one thing that these reports really miss is that it's not just real estate investors who will be harmed in the case of a climate tipping point being reached. There are potential impacts of a loss of net worth due to flooding risk on housing mobility and ultimately on the health and well-being of residents. We don't really know where those people are in most states, if they feel stranded in a home which is at risk of flooding, or if they have the resources to move out by their own means. So this is the problem statement that our organization has tried to address, to try to figure out where those people are and how they can be assisted. So with that, I'll turn to my research on buyout program policies and practices. I've focused here because these programs are incredibly administratively complex and capital intensive on contact with potential participants, means of compensating participants via these programs, and the kinds of case management practices that Linda was describing. Basically, how do they support or address the individual and varying needs of participating households who are trying to relocate? And so I had the opportunity to speak with program managers, case managers, tenant relocation specialists, and subcontractors who worked with 3 different programs in the Northeast in order to really try to understand how do these programs, how have they developed their social capacity, as Linda was describing? So how do they actually support people and help them through the process? So what I did is a literature review about buyout program policies and administration, as well as conducted these 3 case studies of these 3 programs: the New York Rising program, which is sunsetting, the New York City Build It Back program, which is also sunsetting, and the New Jersey Blue Acres program, which is an ongoing program and will continue to be offered. I conducted semi-structured interviews and also reviewed the manuals that the programs follow. Oops, sorry, I forgot to switch to this. So just a quick review of buyout literature. I don't want to dwell too much on this because Linda already gave such a great review of them. I'll just say, in particular, buyout programs are framed as being the only permanent solution to eliminating flood risk by acquiring properties and converting them to open space. They are voluntary programs theoretically, and so each household has to decide whether a buyout is in their interest versus the other adaptation options that they might have the resources to pursue, such as elevating or floodproofing their homes, or if they have the resources to do that, because that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, or in some cases, abandoning their homes to be foreclosed upon. And so I think it's important to understand buyouts in relationship to the other options that households have, and in evaluating what kinds of outcomes households might experience as compared to whether they abandoned their home or tried to flood-proof it. So there are simple programs in theory where stranded residents tell the government they're ready to move elsewhere. The government helps them move by buying the property, and this real estate transaction it helps mitigate flood hazards in an area. In practice, we see, I think a really great report was this NRDC study that found extremely long wait times for buyouts, looking across the country at all of the different FEMA-funded buyouts, that the access to these programs was not very equitable, and that they are not very effective. And so you can see here, it's quite small, but the comparison in the timeline for how long it takes to simply rebuild your house using National Flood Insurance Program payouts versus the time it might take to wait for a buyout. And so when we think about when participants might decide to opt out of a program and drop out of a program in order to just rebuild, I think this is the kind of timeline that this shorter timeline for rebuilding is really what buyout programs are competing against in a way. Another criticism of buyouts is that they've not necessarily reduced household social vulnerability or flood exposure. Devin McGee and Sherry Brokop-Binder led this study to look at results from the buyout programs one of the buyout programs that I studied, and found that 99% of the households that participated relocated to an area of higher social vulnerability or poverty, and over 20% relocated to an area exposed to coastal flood hazards. So I think the consequences of what Linda was describing in terms of where people are actually going with assistance from these programs is really important. And there are a lot of neighborhood, place-based health outcomes for where people end up, which have been the subject of other forms of housing programs, but not necessarily been paid attention to by buyout program managers. And overall, buyout programs show little evidence of policy learning. So one survey of buyout programs found that there's really been limited best practice sharing between programs in their design and implementation, and that really, because they're assembled in a post-disaster context, often they don't try to learn from previous buyout programs, which may have conducted hundreds of transactions and interactions with homeowners and tenants, but they don't actually take advantage of any of the kinds of programmatic capacity lessons that maybe were learned during those processes. And then a final point that I'll just raise is that buyout programs rarely redress historic housing discrimination. So though they intervene in local floodplains and in local housing markets, which are places of racial segregation in the US, they do not, they're kind of colorblind in a way where they rarely explicitly name that segregation could be a dynamic which the buyout program is situated within. And I'd love to talk more about this in our discussion. So overall, buyouts are an important and ineffective solution to a system of interlocking crises at the nexus of socioeconomic inequality, unaffordable housing, legacies of discrimination, and increasing climate risk. Here's just a summary of some of the points that I've made. And with that, I'll just turn to some of what I found interviewing these different buyout program managers and caseworkers. So how can buyout programs create equitable access to relocation assistance at scale? And I would just say at this point that the programs that I looked at are some of the largest and best funded programs that have been offered with with combinations of federal funding as well as kind of state raised dollars. And so I think it's important to note that many smaller municipalities with less planning capacity, less staff, may not be able to emulate all of the things that the practices that these buyout programs utilize. And so it's certainly, I think, helpful to see the variety of different practices that these buyout programs have utilized, but I'm not sure how much is duplicable for these smaller cities. So I focused for these post-Sandy buyout programs on contact and understanding how buyout programs have and can engage and prioritize residents in need. And found that by and large, these programs delineate areas of eligibility using their sense of where flood damage occurred, as well as local planning objectives, but that determination of kind of the eligible area was not a participatory process. And so, and then once the actual participation was opened up, it was largely kind of a passive process of recruitment. So all three programs make applications available online, and sometimes have meetings to talk about the programs, but don't really actively recruit or make sure that everybody in a given neighborhood knows about the program. And once people do apply, there are these very specific eligibility criteria which are determined by the programs. And so here's one example from the New Jersey Blue Acres program. They use, like I described, a passive recruitment tactic. So this kind of voluntary expression of interest form, which they're still accepting continuously. And then they hold a neighborhood public meeting to describe the program. They have found that these applications are very helpful for starting conversations with local government officials about the desire for buyouts in their areas. And this is really important because local officials are a key constituency to have at the table, and actually are necessary in terms of utilizing the parcels that are secured with buyouts for any kind of purpose. And so we see, here both, I think, a better practice in terms of doing some forms of neighborhood engagement, but in terms of the actual recruitment strategy, a fairly standard method. When we think about how programs could prioritize participant needs instead, I looked to a recent report by Carlos Martin and for the Urban Institute, where they consulted with a lot of different experts and found that prioritization of 3 different criteria versus just kind of opening it up to whoever comes first to the program could be important. And so the criteria that they looked at was exposure to hazards and a climate change effect, social vulnerability, and critically, kind of the well-informed decisions and consent of residents. And so when we think about kind of who participates, I think the model that they advance is that it should be based off of this kind of proactive community planning and the expressed desires of stranded residents to shape program priorities. So really kind of more of a bottom-up approach. And one thing to understand about, how you would have to go about assessing what an individual household wants is the need for canvassing strategies. So how do we inform programs? We'd have to actually go out and ask people what they want. So we can see that households have disparities in knowledge and resources and access to technology. And so an active canvassing strategy could help accommodate those differences. We don't see many buyout programs actually employing these methods. There are limitations to canvassing, to being able to actually go out and ask people if they want to buy it or not, including low response rates, administrators not knowing which homes are vacant or abandoned versus just kind of unresponsive, changing conditions on the ground, so maybe subsequent flood events between when contact is made with residents, homeowners moving out of their homes and moving in renters potentially, and landlords' incentives to overlook flood risks and not want to participate in programs, voluntary programs like buyouts that are made available. There are other kinds of limitations, including residents' mistrust of local government, so perhaps due to histories of forced displacement or fears that they're going to be taken advantage of for the benefit of local real estate developers. Perhaps if it's been a long time since the last flood event, a lack of urgency or ignorance about flooding and the risk level that they experience at their home, their assumptions that their home value might continue to grow despite their flood risk, and potentially misconceptions about buyouts that both renters and homeowners in the flood zone might not know that they're at risk. So especially if they've moved in fairly recently. The next thing I'll turn to is compensation. And so how can buyouts actually address housing needs? I think this was a major gap in the literature, was trying to understand whether or not receiving pre-storm fair market value for your home can actually secure you housing outside of the flood zone. So oftentimes the housing that people are living in, when I was speaking with the program managers, they said, well, people were concerned that if they just received kind of the fair market value of their home, that they weren't going to be able to actually afford to move in anywhere else. And so, or they would move in somewhere and would immediately be foreclosed upon because they can't afford the cost of this new home. So it really highlights this kind of rehousing cost gap, where if you look at the kind of fair market value of their home and their other wealth assets, the kind of discounts that they might see that I was citing from the national kind of literature because of their flood risk, and the debts that they might hold, and that might actually be increasing because of the financial impacts of this kind of recovering from flooding, recovering from disaster, that might not actually be able to secure them a comparable home nearby. So the question here is kind of, are we, by participating, are households actually putting themselves into conditions of housing instability? And there are some methods from the 3 programs that I looked at that might suggest what could be done by other buyout programs to try to increase the generosity of the offer that's being made to participants. So one thing that could be done is pegging compensation to the cost of replacement housing, which is actually the method that's used for tenants who are displaced to look at their current rent and incomes, and actually they are required to provide a number of different options which are comparable, decent, safe, and sanitary is kind of the language. Another suggestion would be offering methods of disputing appraised values of homes. So, and I think the managers that I spoke to emphasized that clear and consistent methods are really important in order for homeowners to perceive them as fair. And then a final kind of innovation that the New York Rising State Buyout Program offered was to kind of provide a 5% incentive for households that move nearby, increasing the generosity of the offer they could make. there are limitations, I think, to buyout programs making more generous offers to each participating household, because that could actually decrease the total number of households that could participate, given the kind of a set amount of funding. And then finally, I'll just conclude by offering a couple thoughts about case management, this idea of the social capacity of programs to support and retain participants. We did see a number of different interesting and kind of novel approaches to supporting people that, especially the New York City Build It Back program and the New Jersey Blue Acres program offered to participants, including they were willing to negotiate with banks when participants were underwater in their mortgages in order to try to get some mortgage relief so that they could afford to move somewhere else. We saw many programs will provide a little bit of assistance avoiding duplication of benefits and fulfilling their kind of other regulatory requirements. And then we see, frequently that program managers will extend timelines to be more accommodating to the schedules and lives of participants. So, for example, some wanted to receive their buyout when after their child had graduated from high school or after they kind of retired. So really kind of trying to be accommodating to different life circumstances and being able to meet, in flexible hours and on location, helping homeowners who have kind of different legal complications, which some are just, very unique and not very foreseeable. Like there'll be right-of-ways that are on a corner of somebody's property. And then finally helping tenants, and in some cases even homeowners, find suitable replacement housing, like I was talking about earlier. And there are studies that show that the perceived helpfulness of local officials by participants actually eases the acceptance, or the participants' willingness to accept a mitigation offer. So there is a kind of a statistically significant effect of having your program administrators and your case managers being perceived as helpful by participants and how they feel about the buyout after the fact. I'd really love to discuss with Liz, our moderator, some of these findings that she's seen recently studying the New York State program, where they found that buyouts can represent a desirable opportunity to escape, but a real lack of longitudinal data to track outcomes for participants and understand how policies like compensation or case management might have contributed to those outcomes and how people feel about staying versus going. And across the board, all of the staff that I spoke to and managers for these programs had little data to work with to evaluate what kinds of long-term outcomes participants are experiencing. So this is a major gap. And then I just have a couple discussion questions about this idea of strandedness and how it might inform our understanding of displacement, to also conceive of kind of conditions where people are still kind of stuck in their house and are experiencing kind of harmful health impacts. I'm still working through some of the kind of ethical assumptions and methodological questions of what this rehousing gap might suggest to New York State policymakers. And then I think it'd be really interesting to talk about, could buyouts be explicitly designed as reparative policies to adjust for baseline inequities that we see in American society, such as the kind of historic and widespread racial disparities between the prices of equivalent housing and in the appraised values of houses. And then finally, just to kind of speak to the contemporary moment, what are the limitations of voluntary housing assistance programs like buyouts, given evidence of a really massive underutilization of COVID-19 recovery programs, like rental assistance funds, which are similarly voluntary programs that people who are housing insecure apply to, but we see that they're very underutilized. And so, and finally, whatever happens on this kind of demand side, with the relocation policies, there's a lot of supply side constrictions right now, with housing prices going up more in the last year than in the previous 30 years. And so there's a real shortage of affordable housing and single family homes across the country. And no matter how generous a buyout offer is, we're really going to, I think, run into these restrictions in housing availability, and that a buyout program, no existing buyout program has really figured out how to change that situation. So I will stop there and say thank you. Please feel free to reach out to me via this email. Liz, you're muted. Can anyone hear?
Okay, you can hear me?
Hello?
Maybe while we're waiting for Liz to sort it out, can we encourage the people who are still here to submit some more questions? Very happy to engage with you all to the extent this format allows.
I see there's a question about from Marianne, it looks like. Oh, sorry, Linda, you already responded.
No worries. I was going to say for you guys, Osamu and Sara, in your work, I feel like all of us are kind of saying similar things. And so it seems kind of almost obvious what you would recommend to FEMA or other offices doing this work. And one of that is the intersectionality of this issue and how it has to be done in tandem with many different agencies. And unfortunately, Sara, your research doesn't seem super promising in terms of what those current collaborative networks and efforts, especially at least from the 100RC, seem to have done for these groups. So maybe the buyout people are really clamoring and saying, oh yeah, it's intersectional, but do you see that recognition from the other agencies that we think flood folks should be working with? And if so, what does that conversation look like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think people recognize, and again, I don't think my conclusion is that collaboration doesn't matter and that we don't need to break down the silos, right? I think that I've heard that so many times in more qualitative research contexts, right? But I think, I think the bottom line is it's probably very contextual and complicated, and each city, it's hard to, I think, make these kind of big generalizations, right, about our exactly what collaboration patterns are most effective. It's what I think comes out of this. But I do still think that we need, there needs to be more collaboration. And I do feel like I've heard many times about how challenging it is that it's these kind of like these silos between different departments, different agencies, different levels of government that are huge barriers. Yeah. So I mean, I totally agree with that. I would say it was surprising that our research kind of didn't come out that way or as clear, but I think that is just the fact that cities are super complicated and complex, and it's always going to be really difficult in a small sample size to be able to pull out those differences, right? Mm. Osamu, did you have anything you wanted to add?
It's definitely dispiriting to hear what you're saying about collaboration and how fruitless it's been, because there really is such a need for more housing people in the buyout space to really, I mean, to be blunt, because I don't think, for a lot of local government officials, they're coded as housing programs, even though at the end of the day, that's what they are, is they're moving people between houses. And so I think there's a real lack of expertise on that front in informing these programs, because there is a lot we know now about residential mobility and counseling and housing first programs. There's just all of these examples of other kinds of housing programs to learn from. And I don't think, because buyouts have been so coded as hazard mitigation, that there's really been that shared learning. And then like I was saying, there's really not been a lot of shared learning between buyout programs themselves. So it definitely feels dispiriting, I would say.
That also seems like something from the national level, that tone could be set by having at least FEMA and HUD be more integrated in their policy and funding package design, if not eventually moving some of that funding from FEMA into HUD altogether. We have a question here from Anne Schneider. Will the emphasis on equity communities leave out the slightly higher but still middle class small cities from adaptation funding? Keep in mind that cities smaller than 50,000 do not get direct block grants and have to compete against each other for funding. Big cities get more per capita and get the funds directly. I think this is a really, I'm not quite sure if the phrasing of the question here is talking about middle class as opposed to low income, or about smaller cities as opposed to big cities, maybe a mix of both of those. I think in terms of the size of the city, this is where I would put the emphasis on institution building more at the state and county levels, because they're able to provide a sort of a baseline support system for all of the different localities. Whereas if you rely on every city to establish their own buyout program, that's going to always mean that most small places can only act in a reactionary fashion. So I think that scale of the institution building is really, really important. And unfortunately, the metropolitan regional scale is not a very strong one in most metropolitan regions of the US. So that means counties and I think states to some extent are more important. On the income question, I don't know if you guys want to take a stab at that.
I'm not seeing that question. Is there like a second part?
Slightly higher, but still middle class, small cities. I don't think it's a trade-off necessarily, as it may sometimes be framed, that if we prioritize low income, then the middle class suburbs won't get the housing. This is really contentious in Houston's design of their priority for who should get the funding first. It wasn't even who will get most funding, but just the order in which the projects happen in Houston after they pass their $2 billion bond act. And I think that there were schemes that would have prioritized explicitly low-income groups first, or those who were hit hardest by the disaster in certain ways. But those were politically less palatable than a national standard, which is a SOVI standard, the Social Vulnerability Index, that says based on these certain metrics of social vulnerability, they would be prioritized first. But that does not necessarily have anything to do with historic records of who got investment or who actually was hit hardest, or what people actually need. So I do think that they are tricky, but at the same time, if you're able to get some of this right for those who are hit the hardest, it will also benefit those who are hit less hard. So there are so many different aspects of this that are poorly designed now, and improving some of that will, I think, have broad sweeping benefits to everyone who needs a buyout.
I just add that, from my understanding, Biden administration has been putting a lot of money into the FEMA BRIC program, building resilient infrastructure in communities, I think. And that program in the first round of funding that was allocated last year really did, I'd say this kind of like small cities, and particularly those in the middle of the country, really struggled to be competitive. And I'm not entirely certain if the changes that they've made this year will result in them being more competitive for flood mitigation funding. A lot are disqualified by not having up-to-date building codes or any building codes at all, which is something that the BRIC program has really pushed as being kind of step one. And so I do think there are some almost like fundamentals of government capacity, of planning and city administration that they're looking to see. And I think cities that don't, and towns that don't have that kind of baseline, are going to continue to struggle to compete in the flood mitigation front. Are we being booted? Oop. Okay. Oh no, and Liz still can't talk.
Hi, I'll speak on behalf of Liz. This is the back-end production coordinator. Sorry about the technical issues here, but I just wanted to note that the session is now coming to a close. Thank you so much for our moderator, Liz, and all of the speakers, Sara, Osamu, Linda, for this incredible set of research that you shared with us. And I just wanted to note that we, in a couple minutes, have a keynote roundtable session happening with the three presenters on this slide here. We encourage everyone who joined us today to join for this session as well, and to enjoy the rest of the amazing set of sessions that are happening for the rest of today, as well as tomorrow as part of the Adaptation Symposium. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions or would like to be connected to any of the presenters today, I'll leave a, let me see if there's a way to, if you could leave any additional questions on the Q&A now, I'll leave that open for another minute. If you have anything else, and I'd be happy to follow up with you. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Bye, Liz.